It's 3 in the morning, February 1971, and somewhere beneath the black churning waters off Fremantle, Western Australia, something is moving. Not whales, not fishing trawlers, something that shouldn't be there. And before we dive into one of the most terrifying intelligence discoveries of the Cold War, let me know in the comments where you're watching from. Because what happened in those cold Australian waters would send shockwaves around the entire free world. Now, most people think the Cold War was fought in Berlin, in Cuba, in the frozen tundra of the Arctic Circle. They're wrong. Some of the most critical, most terrifying confrontations happened in places you'd never expect. Like the sun-drenched coast of Western Australia, where a single stubborn sonar operator refused to ignore what his equipment was telling him, even when everyone from his commanding officer to intelligence analysts in Canberra told him he was losing his mind. This isn't just a story about submarines. This is a story about what happens when institutional arrogance meets working-class expertise, when bureaucratic convenience collides with inconvenient truth, when the entire defense of a nation rests on one man's refusal to be silent. His name was Chief Petty Officer Thomas McAllister, though everyone at HMAS Stirling Naval Base just called him Mac. At 53 years old, Mac was the kind of sailor the modern Navy was quietly trying to phase out. A veteran of the Korean War, a man who'd learned sonar technology when it was still more art than science, when you had to feel the ocean through your fingertips and hear its secrets through analog crackle and hiss. He'd grown up in a fishing village in Tasmania, the son of a lighthouse keeper. And he knew the ocean the way some men know scripture. Mac didn't have a university degree. He didn't speak in acronyms or PowerPoint presentations. He spoke in bearing degrees and frequency signatures, in the subtle language of pressure waves traveling through salt water at speeds most officers only understood theoretically. And on that freezing February morning, Mac's equipment was telling him something that made his blood run cold. There was a contact, a submarine contact, Soviet. And it was close, too close. But here's where the story gets interesting, because Mac didn't just discover one submarine that morning. What he discovered would fundamentally challenge everything the Australian defence establishment believed about their security, their sovereignty, and their place in the Pacific theatre. What he discovered would reveal that while politicians in Canberra were sleeping soundly, convinced that Australia was too far, too irrelevant, too protected by distance and American alliances to matter in the grand chess game between superpowers, the Soviet Navy had turned their coastline into a surveillance grid so sophisticated, so comprehensive, that it would make the hair stand up on the back of your neck. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let's go back to that moment. 3 in the morning, the sonar shack dimly lit by phosphorescent screens, the eternal ping and echo of active sonar filling the small space with its hypnotic rhythm. Mac had been tracking a contact for 47 minutes. The signature was distinct, a subtle harmonic frequency, a specific blade rate from a propeller system that didn't match any NATO vessel. He'd heard this signature before, years ago, during classified briefings about Soviet Foxtrot class diesel-electric submarines. The kind that could run silent, run deep, and disappear into thermocline layers like ghosts. He picked up the phone to the bridge. Contact bearing 215 degrees, range approximately 12 nautical miles, depth estimated 150 meters. Recommend we go to alert status. The response came from Lieutenant Commander Harrison Webb, the newly appointed executive officer who'd arrived from Canberra just 6 weeks earlier with an MBA from some prestigious business school and exactly zero combat experience. Webb's voice carried that particular brand of irritation that comes from being woken at 3 a.m. by a subordinate he considered charitably obsolete. McAllister, we've been through this. That's a whale pod. We've had 3 false alarms this month because you keep mistaking marine life for submarines. The Soviet Pacific Fleet is busy in Vladivostok. There's no strategic value in Australian waters. Use some common sense. Mac felt his jaw tighten. Sir, with respect, I know the difference between a humpback and a submarine. This contact is metallic, it's maintaining a steady course, and its acoustic signature matches. Enough. Log it as a biological contact and stop wasting everyone's time. We have real work to do preparing for the joint exercises with the Americans next month. I don't need you creating phantom threats that'll make us look like paranoid colonials who see Russians under every bed. The line went dead. Mac sat back in his chair, staring at the green glow of his screen, watching the contact maintain its perfectly steady bearing. Whales didn't move like that. Whales didn't generate propeller harmonics. Whales didn't position themselves with geometric precision relative to naval patrol routes. He made a decision that would either end his career or save his country. He didn't log it as a biological contact. He kept tracking, and as the sun began to rise over Fremantle, painting the ocean in shades of pink and gold that contrasted savagely with what Mac was seeing on his screens, he noticed something that made his hands start to shake. The contact wasn't alone. There were more. At first, just 2 additional signatures, so faint they could barely be distinguished from ambient ocean noise. But Mac had been doing this for 31 years. He knew how to filter, how to listen, how to hear what others missed. By noon, he'd identified 7 distinct contacts, all diesel-electric, all maintaining formation, all tracking the patrol patterns of the Australian fleet with the precision of wolves circling sheep. He went to Webb again. This time he brought printed readouts, frequency analysis, everything he could document. Webb was in the officers' mess, enjoying lunch with 3 other officers, all of them young, all of them educated at the Royal Australian Naval College, all of them regarding Mac with the barely concealed contempt that the credentialed reserve for the self-taught. "Sir, I need 5 minutes of your time. It's urgent." Webb didn't even look up from his meal. "McAllister, I thought I made myself clear. There are no Soviet submarines off Fremantle. The strategic assessment from fleet intelligence is unambiguous. The Russians have neither the capability nor the interest in maintaining a presence this far south. Now, I appreciate your enthusiasm for your work, but perhaps it's time we discussed your retirement options. You've served honorably, but modern naval warfare requires a different skill set." One of the other officers, a young lieutenant named Phillips, actually laughed. "Mac still thinks we're fighting the Battle of the Atlantic. Someone should tell him the war ended in 1945. The table erupted in polite chuckles. Mac stood there, feeling the heat rise in his face, the printouts crumpling slightly in his clenched fists. But he didn't raise his voice. He'd been raised by a lighthouse keeper who taught him that the ocean doesn't care about your ego, and shouting at a storm just wastes energy. "Permission to submit a formal intelligence report to Fleet Command in Sydney, sir." Webb sighed with theatrical weariness. "If you insist on embarrassing yourself, go ahead. But when this comes back as equipment malfunction or operator error, and it will, we're going to have a very serious conversation about your fitness for duty." Mac nodded slowly, turned, and walked out. Behind him, he heard Phillips say, "Poor old bastard, probably has early-stage dementia. My grandfather got like that, started seeing conspiracies everywhere." More laughter. The sound of it followed Mac down the corridor like mockery incarnate. But here's what Webb and his educated colleagues didn't know. Here's what their PowerPoint briefings and strategic assessments and comfortable assumptions had blinded them to. Mac had spent 3 years of his life, from 1967 to 1970, on loan to the American SOSUS network, the sound surveillance system that ringed the Atlantic and Pacific with underwater microphones, listening for Soviet submarines. He'd been stationed in classified facilities where he'd done nothing but study Soviet acoustic signatures, learn their tactics, memorize the specific sounds their propellers made, the way their hulls resonated, the patterns they followed when conducting intelligence-gathering operations. And he'd seen this before. Not off Australia. That was new, that was terrifying. But off Hawaii, off Guam, off the Philippines. The Soviets didn't just send one submarine on surveillance missions. They sent entire wolf packs, coordinated flotillas that worked in concert to map every detail of enemy fleet movements, communication patterns, response times. They were preparing. Always preparing. For a war that might come tomorrow or might come in 20 years, but would definitely come eventually. Over the next 72 hours, Mac barely slept. He refined his tracking, adjusted his equipment, cross-referenced with weather patterns and known biological migration routes, and with each passing hour, the picture grew more horrifying. There weren't 7 contacts, there were 15, then 23, then 38. The Soviet Navy had turned the approaches to Fremantle into a surveillance grid. He documented everything. Page after page of data. Maps showing the positions, analysis of their coordination patterns. He submitted it through official channels to Fleet Intelligence. And then he waited. The response came back 5 days later. A single-page letter, bureaucratic and dismissive. Assessment reviewed, contacts determined to be combination of biological sources, surface vessel acoustic reflection, and equipment calibration errors. Recommend standard maintenance protocol for sonar equipment. No further action required. Mac read that letter 3 times. Then he did something he'd never done in 31 years of naval service. He picked up the phone and called someone outside the chain of command. His name was James Whitlam, and 15 years earlier, he'd been an 18-year-old seaman who Mac had pulled out of the freezing ocean after a training accident off the coast of Victoria. Mac had given him CPR, brought him back from the edge of death, and never mentioned it again, because that's what you did. You helped people. You didn't make it about yourself. James Whitlam was now Rear Admiral James Whitlam, Deputy Chief of Naval Operations based in Canberra. When Mac explained what he was seeing, there was a long silence on the other end of the line. Then Whitlam said, "You're certain about this?" "As certain as I've ever been about anything, sir." "Give me 48 hours. What happened next became classified for the next 30 years. But I'll tell you what actually occurred." Whitlam didn't trust the formal intelligence channels. He'd been in the Navy long enough to know that institutional momentum can be a greater enemy than any foreign adversary. Instead, he made 3 phone calls, one to the American Office of Naval Intelligence in Pearl Harbor, one to a personal friend at ASIS, the Australian Secret Intelligence Service, and one to the Prime Minister's National Security Advisor. Within 24 hours, a P-3 Orion Maritime Patrol aircraft was conducting routine exercises off Fremantle, equipped with the most sophisticated magnetic anomaly detection equipment in the Southern Hemisphere. Within 36 hours, an American Los Angeles-class attack submarine, nominally on its way to joint exercises in the Indian Ocean, made an unscheduled detour to Australian waters, with explicit orders to find out what the hell was actually down there. What they found made the Cuban Missile Crisis look like a minor diplomatic misunderstanding. The Americans confirmed Mac's contacts. Then they found more. The final count, when the full extent of Soviet presence was mapped using assets from 3 nations' intelligence services, was 63. Submarines. 63. Diesel-electric boats from the Soviet Pacific Fleet, operating in coordinated groups, maintaining perfect operational security, positioned along every major shipping lane, every naval approach, every strategic choke point within 500 nautical miles of the Australian coast. They'd been there for months. Some intelligence analysts later concluded they'd been establishing this presence for over a year, rotating crews, maintaining what amounted to a peacetime blockade, designed to gather every scrap of intelligence about Australian and American naval operations in the Pacific. They had detailed information on patrol routes, communication protocols, response times, fleet composition. They knew where every ship would be before the ships themselves knew. It was the most comprehensive intelligence penetration of any Western nation's territorial approaches during the entire Cold War, and nobody had noticed because everyone had been too busy dismissing the concerns of a chief petty officer who didn't have a college degree. The briefing room in Canberra was standing room only. Webb was there, looking like he'd aged 10 years in 10 days. So was Phillips, the lieutenant who joked about dementia. So were intelligence analysts, admirals, representatives from the Defense Ministry, and representatives from the American and British navies. At the front of the room, Rear Admiral Whitlam stood next to a map covered in red marks, each one representing a Soviet submarine contact. And sitting quietly in the back row, in dress uniform that he rarely wore, was Chief Petty Officer Thomas McAllister. Whitlam let the silence stretch until it became unbearable. Then he spoke, his voice cold as the ocean Mac had been monitoring. "Gentlemen, we are looking at the single greatest intelligence failure in our nation's history. For a minimum of 8 months, potentially as long as 18 months, the Soviet Pacific Fleet has been conducting comprehensive surveillance of our naval operations, our commercial shipping, and our strategic coastal infrastructure. They know our codes, they know our patrol patterns, they know our response capabilities. If war had broken out at any point during this period, our entire fleet would have been sunk before we finished breakfast." Webb tried to speak. "Sir, the intelligence assessment from—" "Was wrong," Whitlam cut him off. "Catastrophically, inexcusably wrong. And do you know why it was wrong? Because the people preparing those assessments were looking at spreadsheets and strategic models instead of listening to the man who actually knows how to hear submarines." He gestured toward Mac. Chief McAllister detected the first contact on February 14th. He reported it immediately. He was dismissed as incompetent. He reported 7 contacts 3 days later. He was threatened with early retirement. He submitted formal documentation of 15 contacts. It was filed as equipment malfunction. The room had gone dead silent. Webb's face had turned the color of old paper. Whitlam continued, "While we were congratulating ourselves on our sophisticated analysis and our modern naval education, a 53-year-old sonar operator with 3 decades of practical experience was trying to tell us that our entire defense posture was compromised, and we didn't just ignore him, we humiliated him, we mocked him, we questioned his competence and his sanity." Phillips was staring at his shoes. Other officers were staring at the map, at the walls, anywhere but at Mac. "Chief McAllister," Whitlam said, his voice softening slightly, "would you please come forward?" Mac stood, walked to the front of the room. He didn't look triumphant. He looked tired. Whitlam turned to face him directly. On behalf of the Royal Australian Navy and the Commonwealth of Australia, I apologize. Your expertise, your diligence, and your refusal to be silenced quite literally saved this nation from a strategic disaster we still don't fully understand. If you hadn't persisted, if you'd let yourself be bullied into silence, we might not have discovered this penetration until it was too late. Then Whitlam did something extraordinary. He saluted Mac, a rear admiral saluting a chief petty officer. In the rigid hierarchy of naval tradition, it was a reversal of the natural order that made everyone in the room understand exactly what had happened here. Webb stood. His voice was barely above a whisper. Chief McAllister, I don't have words. I let my ego, my assumptions about modern warfare, my arrogance, blind me to what you were trying to tell me. I questioned your competence when I should have been questioning my own. I nearly cost lives. I nearly cost everything. I'm sorry isn't adequate, but it's all I have. Mac looked at Webb for a long moment. Then he extended his hand. Sir, I don't want your apology. I want you to remember this. Every time someone comes to you with information that challenges your assumptions, every time someone with less formal education but more practical experience tries to tell you something important, I want you to remember this room. Remember these red marks on the map. Remember what almost happened because we stopped listening to the people who actually do the work. Webb took his hand, shook it, and Mac could see the man was crying. But the story doesn't end there. Because 3 weeks later, something happened that would reveal yet another layer to Mac's extraordinary capabilities. The government decided to host a state dinner honoring the Australian and American personnel involved in detecting and responding to the Soviet submarine presence. Mac was invited, reluctantly accepted, showed up in his dress uniform looking deeply uncomfortable among diplomats and politicians. During the dinner, there was entertainment, a string quartet performing classical pieces, and Mac, who'd been sitting quietly, barely touching his food, suddenly stood up during a Beethoven piece, walked over to the quartet, and pointed out a subtle timing error in the second violin's playing. The musicians looked startled. The conductor, a renowned maestro from the Sydney Symphony Orchestra, looked offended. And you are a music critic, Chief McAllister? Mac shook his head. No, sir, but I grew up with it. My mother was a concert violinist before she married my father and moved to Tasmania. She taught me to play when I was 4. She used to say that music and sonar are the same discipline. Both require you to hear what others miss, to detect patterns in apparent chaos, to understand that timing is everything. The conductor stared at him. Can you play? Mac hesitated, then nodded. Haven't touched a violin in 30 years. But yes, sir, I can play. What happened next became legendary in Australian naval circles. Mac borrowed a violin, and for the next 12 minutes, he played a piece his mother had taught him. A haunting Tasmanian folk melody that she'd adapted into a classical structure. The room went completely silent. Diplomats forgot their champagne. Politicians forgot their speeches. And when he finished, there wasn't a dry eye in the room. Because they finally understood. This wasn't just a sonar operator who got lucky. This was a man whose entire life had been about listening, about hearing the patterns beneath the surface, about understanding that truth doesn't care about credentials or rank or assumptions. His mother had taught him to hear music. His father had taught him to hear the ocean. And those two gifts, combined with 3 decades of experience that no university could teach, had saved a nation. The next day, Mac was promoted to warrant officer, the highest rank an enlisted sailor can achieve. He was also awarded the Commendation for Distinguished Service, and the Americans gave him their Legion of Merit. But Mac never put the awards on his wall. He put them in a drawer and went back to work. As for the Soviet submarines, they quietly withdrew over the following months. The message had been sent, received, and understood. Australia was not undefended. Australia was not asleep. And the man who proved it was a 53-year-old fisherman's son who'd learned to hear truth in the silence between sounds. This story, the full extent of it, was classified until 2001. When it was finally declassified, journalists asked Mac, who was 73 at the time and long retired, why he'd persisted when everyone told him he was wrong. His answer was simple: because the ocean doesn't lie. People lie. Bureaucracies lie. Assumptions lie. But pressure waves traveling through salt water at 1500 meters per second don't have agendas. They don't care about your rank or your education. They're just truth. And if you know how to listen, they'll tell you everything you need to know. I just listened. So here's what this story teaches us. Real expertise isn't about credentials on a wall. It's about years of experience, practical wisdom, and the humility to keep learning. True authority comes not from position but from proven capability. And some of the most dangerous threats we face aren't external enemies but internal arrogance, the institutional momentum that makes us dismiss inconvenient truths because acknowledging them would require us to admit we were wrong. Mac's story is about more than submarines. It's about what happens when we confuse confidence with competence, when we let pride blind us to reality, when we forget that the person doing the work often knows more than the person giving the orders. It's about the courage to speak truth to power, the wisdom to trust those who've earned that trust through years of dedication, and the grace to admit when we've failed. And it's a reminder that the most important sentence in any language might just be 4 simple words. I don't know, but, followed by a willingness to learn, to listen, to acknowledge that expertise comes in forms we might not expect, from people we might underestimate. Now, if this story moved you, if it made you think about the quiet heroes in your own life who persist despite being dismissed, hit that like button. Drop a comment telling me about someone who knew the truth when others refused to listen. Share this with someone who needs to hear that expertise and education aren't always the same thing. And subscribe, because there are thousands of stories like this. Stories about ordinary people who did extraordinary things, about wisdom triumphing over arrogance, about the power of simply paying attention when everyone else is too busy being certain. The ocean remembers, Mac remembered, and now you'll remember too.